What happens when one of Hollywood's most iconic tough guys steps into a daytime TV studio and suddenly finds himself facing a host determined to put him on the defensive? That's exactly what happened when Clint Eastwood sat down for what was supposed to be a simple promotional interview. And trust me, the conversation was about to take a turn nobody in that studio expected. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director known for playing men who never needed to raise their voices to command a room, arrived expecting a routine appearance. Instead, he ended up locked in a tense exchange with Joy Behar that transformed a friendly interview into something far more uncomfortable. Before we get into the moment that changed the entire atmosphere, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment, because what happened next was the kind of television confrontation people remember. The cameras went live, and Whoopi Goldberg welcomed their special guest with a warm smile. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Clint Eastwood. The audience erupted as Eastwood calmly walked out and took his seat, giving a polite nod before settling back with his hands resting on the chair. "Thank you for having me," he said in his unmistakably gravelly voice. At first, everything seemed completely normal. Whoopi kept the conversation focused on Eastwood's latest project, asking what attracted him to the story. Eastwood explained that the heart of it was second chances, the idea that people can still change even after the world has decided they are beyond redemption. Sarah Haynes immediately picked up on the theme, leaning forward as she asked how someone with such an extraordinary career decides which stories are still worth telling. Eastwood didn't hesitate. For him, the answer was truth. He wanted stories that revealed something genuine about people and the struggles they faced, arguing that Hollywood already had more than enough fantasy. For several minutes, the discussion remained relaxed and surprisingly thoughtful. Eastwood talked about directing, working with actors, and finding the emotional core of a story, while the audience listened closely to every word. But there was one person in the studio who had barely said a thing. Joy Behar sat quietly, watching the conversation with a knowing expression, almost as if she were waiting for the exact right opening. And then she finally took it. "Clint, can I ask you something?" Joy interrupted, and instantly the tone of the interview changed. She pointed out that Eastwood often spoke about truth and redemption, then questioned whether some of his past comments and political associations conflicted with that message. The room suddenly felt different. Whoopi gave Joy a brief warning look, but the question was already out there. Eastwood slowly turned toward her, his expression tightening just enough to show that he understood exactly where she was going. "Which comments would those be, Joy?" he asked. Joy responded with a deliberately casual tone, referring to his support for unnamed political figures who had made controversial remarks about women and minorities. Eastwood calmly pushed back, saying he didn't remember making statements that demeaned either group. But Joy wasn't finished. She shifted the argument from what Eastwood had personally said to what his political endorsements might represent, pressing him on the message those associations could send. The other hosts exchanged uneasy looks as it became obvious that the interview had moved far beyond the conversation they had started with. Then Eastwood leaned back and looked directly at Joy with the kind of stare that had intimidated villains on screen for decades. He reminded her that he had been working in Hollywood long before she had entered the industry and had spent his career working with people from countless backgrounds and political viewpoints. What mattered to him, he explained, was character, not which political side someone belonged to. Joy immediately bristled at the response, raising her voice as she insisted that she had every right to challenge her guests with difficult questions. Eastwood didn't lose his composure. Instead, he made his position perfectly clear. She could ask whatever she wanted, but he didn't have to participate in what he considered a trap designed more to create controversy than encourage an honest conversation. Joy's face reddened as she pushed back, insisting that she was simply asking about his public record and calling that journalism. And that's when Eastwood delivered the line that made the entire exchange even sharper. With a faint chuckle, he questioned whether that was really what journalism had become, because in his experience, journalism meant doing the research, knowing the facts, and coming prepared, not throwing out provocative questions just to see what reaction they might produce. Whoopi could see the conversation slipping away from the film and quickly tried to pull it back. "Maybe we should get back to talking about your movie, Clint." But Joy Behar had no intention of letting the subject go. She insisted that the political questions mattered, arguing that someone with Eastwood's public history shouldn't expect an easy interview after making controversial political statements. Eastwood remained remarkably composed, but there was a noticeable change in his expression. His eyes sharpened with that familiar intensity audiences had seen countless times on screen. Joy then brought up the infamous empty chair moment from years earlier, clearly believing she had finally found the argument that would put him on the defensive. Eastwood immediately understood what she meant and explained that he had been using a creative metaphor to make a point about political accountability. Joy pushed further, questioning whether the stunt had been irrational or excessive. Suddenly, the entire studio went quiet. The audience stopped reacting. The crew seemed frozen in place, and everyone could feel that the interview had reached a completely different level. Then Eastwood leaned slightly forward. His voice became quieter rather than louder, and somehow that made the moment even more intense. He looked directly at Joy and asked her a deceptively simple question. How many films had she made? Joy immediately demanded to know what filmmaking had to do with the discussion. Eastwood didn't argue. He simply asked again, this time narrowing the question, how many films had she directed, produced, or starred in? Joy admitted that she was a television host and comedian, but Eastwood followed with another question, how many Academy Awards had she won? Joy became increasingly defensive, repeatedly insisting that none of this was relevant. But Eastwood wasn't finished. He wanted to know how many careers she had helped launch, how many young performers she had given opportunities to, and how many stories she had created that genuinely connected with audiences. Joy insisted that entertaining people on the show was her job, but the confidence in her voice was beginning to disappear. Eastwood paused and genuinely asked whether that was really what she was doing, because from his perspective, the exchange looked less like an interview and more like an attempt to corner a guest and manufacture controversy for ratings. Sarah Haynes quickly stepped in before the confrontation could escalate any further, reminding everyone that Eastwood's films had entertained audiences around the world and asking him about the most rewarding part of his career. But Eastwood wasn't ready to simply move past what had happened. He turned towards Sarah and said he would gladly answer, explaining that the most satisfying part of his career had been working with true professionals, people who understood that respect comes from what you do, not what you demand from others. Then came the remark that made Joy freeze. Eastwood suggested that professionals don't need to hide behind a group of co-hosts while taking cheap shots at their guests. Joy immediately reacted, visibly stunned by the accusation. She insisted that she was only asking legitimate questions about his political beliefs. Eastwood calmly disagreed. In his view, she wasn't simply exploring his opinions, she was trying to manufacture a dramatic clip that could spread across social media. And according to him, there was a major difference between asking a difficult question and deliberately ambushing someone with it. Joy rejected the accusation, saying she was simply doing her job. Eastwood answered without raising his voice. Her job, he argued, was to interview guests about the reason they had been invited onto the program. He hadn't come there to debate politics. He had come to discuss a film he was proud of, a story centered on redemption, mistakes, and the possibility of becoming a better person. Whoopi made another attempt to reset the conversation, asking Eastwood about the movie's main character. Eastwood explained that the story followed a man who had made serious mistakes but was genuinely trying to change. Then, without taking his eyes off Joy, he delivered a message that seemed almost impossible to miss. Sometimes the greatest obstacle isn't what stands in front of you, but the people determined to define you by everything you did in the past instead of allowing you the chance to grow. The meaning landed immediately. Even Joy seemed to recognize that the comment was directed at her. Sarah quickly praised the message and tried to steer everyone back toward the film, pointing out how powerful redemption can be when used in storytelling. But Joy had already seized on the word. She leaned back into the political argument and asked whether there were actually people who had gone too far to deserve redemption. If someone repeatedly supported divisive political ideas, she challenged, at what point should society stop giving that person another chance? And just like that, the interview was heading straight toward another explosive moment. Eastwood's expression barely changed, but his jaw tightened just enough to signal that his patience was running thin. He looked directly at Joy and asked whether they were actually discussing the character in his film, or whether she was once again trying to turn the conversation into something personal. Joy immediately wrapped her argument in the language of accountability, insisting that public figures had a responsibility to the people who followed them. Eastwood calmly turned the question back on her. If public figures had responsibilities to their audiences, he asked, what responsibility did television hosts have toward the guests sitting across from them? Joy fired back that their responsibility was to ask the difficult questions that mattered. Eastwood's answer came without hesitation. Their responsibility, he said, was to treat people with basic human decency, and judging by the way she was handling the interview, that seemed to be something she had forgotten. The other hosts exchanged nervous looks as the tension climbed another level. Whoopi appeared to be trying to get the producer's attention, but Joy was too focused on what she clearly believed was a winning argument. She laughed sharply at Eastwood's mention of human decency, then attacked the irony of hearing that from someone whose career had been built around violent characters and movies associated with gun culture. The audience reacted immediately with an audible gasp. Even in a show known for heated debates, the comment had crossed into territory nobody expected. Eastwood leaned back and studied Joy in silence for several seconds, almost as if he were reassessing the entire conversation. Then he finally spoke. He told her that he believed he understood the real problem. In his view, she had confused being loud with being correct and confrontation with courage. Then came the accusation that instantly changed the room. He said that beneath all the shouting and aggressive questioning, she was simply acting like a bully with a microphone. Joy looked stunned. Her voice rose sharply as she demanded how he could possibly call her a bully. Eastwood didn't flinch. He calmly repeated the accusation and explained exactly what he meant. Day after day, he said, she sat in a position of power and took shots at guests who were placed in a difficult position because they had come onto her show expecting an interview. She might believe that made her powerful, but in his eyes, it only made her look smaller. That was the moment Joy finally stood up, her face flushed with anger. She reminded him that she had spent years doing this job and had interviewed presidents, celebrities, and world leaders. Eastwood responded with one pointed question. How many of those people had walked away from her show feeling genuinely respected? How many had left believing they had just experienced a professional interview rather than an ambush? Joy struggled to answer, insisting that she didn't have to sit there and take this from him or anyone else. Eastwood agreed with her completely. She didn't have to accept anything from him, he said, just as he didn't have to remain seated while she turned what was supposed to be a discussion about filmmaking into what he considered political theater. At that point, Whoopi finally stepped in and urged both of them to take a breath. But Eastwood had already made up his mind. He slowly rose from his chair and told Whoopi that he believed he and Joy understood each other perfectly now. Joy looked furious, practically shaking with frustration, and insisted that he couldn't simply walk away because he didn't like being asked difficult questions. Eastwood turned toward her with that unmistakable squint and delivered 3 words that instantly silenced the room. "Watch me." He explained that he had come to the show as a courtesy because he wanted to talk about something he genuinely cared about. He had not come there to spend the day as someone's target. Joy desperately reminded him that this was live television and argued that he couldn't simply leave in the middle of an interview. Eastwood calmly challenged that assumption as he reached for his microphone. That, he explained, was exactly what Joy still didn't understand. Real power wasn't about trapping someone in front of a live audience or forcing them to react under pressure. Real power was knowing when to walk away. Joy could see the moment slipping out of her control, so she made one final attempt to stop him, warning that if he left, viewers would assume he simply couldn't handle tough questions. But Eastwood had already made his decision, and what he said next would determine how the entire confrontation ended. Eastwood stopped for a moment and turned toward the main camera, speaking directly to the viewers watching at home. He explained that he had come to the show because he wanted to discuss a film that genuinely mattered to him, but instead he felt he had been deliberately pushed into a confrontation by someone more interested in producing a viral clip than having a meaningful conversation. According to Eastwood, that alone said a great deal about what television had become. Then he turned back toward Joy and addressed her directly. As for whether he could handle difficult questions, he reminded her that he had been answering tough questions for decades, long before she had ever picked up a microphone. The difference, he said, was that the questions were usually coming from professionals who actually knew how to conduct an interview. Joy's face flushed with anger. She fired back, calling him an arrogant has-been and demanding to know how he could insult her on her own show. The words landed like a shockwave. For several seconds, nobody in the studio moved. The audience fell completely silent, the other hosts looked deeply uncomfortable, and even members of the crew seemed unsure where to look. Joy's face flushed with anger. She fired back, calling him an arrogant has-been and demanding to know how he could insult her on her own show. The words landed like a shockwave. For several seconds, nobody in the studio moved. The audience fell completely silent, the other hosts looked deeply uncomfortable, and even members of the crew seemed unsure where to look. Eastwood slowly turned toward Joy, and for a brief moment his expression resembled one of the hardened characters that had defined his legendary career. Calm, controlled, and completely finished with the situation. "Has been," he repeated quietly, almost as if he were considering the word. Then he pointed out how strange it was to hear that insult from someone whose career was largely built around sitting at a table and discussing the achievements of other people. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Eastwood didn't raise his voice, but the tension in the room seemed to intensify with every second. He repeated the word again, slower this time, before explaining that throughout his long career, he had been called many things, but the harshest insults usually came from people who had built something significant themselves. Joy realized the exchange was moving somewhere she hadn't expected, but pride prevented her from backing down. She insisted that she had accomplished plenty. Eastwood looked at her and simply asked, "Have you?" His voice dropped into that low, controlled tone that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. He challenged her to consider how many guests she had offended over the years, how many interviews had turned into controversies, and how many potentially meaningful conversations had been derailed because the confrontation itself became the story. Joy insisted that she was only asking the questions that needed to be asked. Eastwood immediately corrected her. In his view, she wasn't asking questions because they needed answers. She was choosing questions because they generated attention. There was a difference, he explained, between serious journalism and what he described as performance designed to attract an audience, and he suggested that Joy had forgotten which one she was supposed to be doing. Whoopi, realizing the situation was close to completely collapsing, made one final attempt to restore some order. She suggested that everyone start over and encouraged Joy to apologize so they could return to discussing the film. Joy looked at Whoopi in disbelief and demanded to know what she was supposed to apologize for. She claimed she had simply been doing her job. Eastwood immediately stepped in. A host's job, he argued, was to entertain and inform the audience, not to treat guests like targets for sport. Joy weakly denied that she had attacked him, but Eastwood let out a brief laugh that carried no warmth at all. He told her that he had experienced real attacks in his life and knew exactly what one looked like. The difference, he said, was that when someone confronted him in the service, they had the courage to stand in front of him rather than using a television format as protection. By now, the other hosts were openly uncomfortable. Some looked embarrassed, others stunned, while Sarah appeared as though she desperately wanted the entire confrontation to disappear. Even the audience had stopped reacting naturally, shifting nervously in their seats as the tension continued to build. Then Joy tried one final power move. Her voice cracked slightly as she told Eastwood that he clearly believed he was tough, but this was her house. These were her rules, and if he didn't like the questions, he was free to leave. Eastwood smiled, and the expression was colder than anything the studio had seen from him all afternoon. He agreed with her completely. This was indeed her house, he said, and that was precisely the problem. Then he stood fully upright, leaving the panel seated beneath him as he delivered the final assessment. In her house, guests were ambushed. In her house, disagreement was treated as disrespect, and in her house, creating drama mattered more than creating understanding. Eastwood paused, looked around the studio, and delivered the words that made the entire confrontation feel like it had reached its breaking point. "Well, congratulations. You've certainly built yourself quite a house," Eastwood said, his voice carrying a quiet edge as Joy struggled to respond. She insisted that if he believed he could simply walk into her studio and lecture her about television, he had seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. Eastwood immediately corrected her. He wasn't there to teach her how television worked, he said. He was pointing out that what she was doing no longer resembled a genuine interview. To him, it looked more like a circus, with Joy running the show from the center of it. The audience reacted with a collective gasp. Even for daytime television, the exchange had become almost unbelievable. Joy completely lost whatever composure she had left and demanded to know how Eastwood could possibly come onto her program and speak to her that way. "Your show," Eastwood repeated, slowly looking across the panel. Then he glanced toward the other hosts and questioned whether this was actually supposed to be a panel program with multiple voices, because from where he was sitting, it looked more like the Joy Behar Ego Hour with everyone else serving as backup. That comment stunned the room all over again. Whoopi finally stepped in with a firm warning, telling Clint that enough was enough and urging Joy to calm herself down. But Joy was far too angry to listen. She snapped at Whoopi, saying she didn't need anyone telling her to calm down after a guest had walked onto the show with what she called a superior attitude and openly disrespected her in front of a national audience. Eastwood remained completely composed. He quietly reminded her that if anyone had shown disrespect during the interview, it was her. From the moment he had taken his seat, he said, she seemed determined to provoke a fight instead of having an actual conversation. Joy repeated that she had only been doing her job, but by now, even her own words sounded less convincing. Eastwood slowly shook his head. He explained that doing her job would have meant asking about his films, his creative process, his career, or even his thoughts on subjects connected to his work. A good host, he continued, should leave viewers feeling as though they had learned something meaningful, or at least enjoyed a worthwhile conversation. Instead, he gestured toward the cameras and pointed out that the previous 20 minutes had been spent trying to embarrass a guest who had arrived in good faith. And in his opinion, the person who had ultimately been embarrassed was no longer him. It was Joy and the program itself. Joy looked around the panel, seemingly searching for someone to support her, but nobody stepped forward. The other hosts avoided eye contact. The audience appeared increasingly sympathetic toward Eastwood, and even the crew seemed uncomfortable with where the interview had gone. Finally, Joy threw up her hands and suggested that if Eastwood wasn't willing to answer what she considered real questions, perhaps he shouldn't be doing interviews at all. Eastwood was already removing his microphone, but that statement made him pause. He turned toward her and asked whether she genuinely wanted to know what a real question sounded like. Then he faced the main camera once again. A real question, he explained, would be asking what still motivated him to make films after such a long career. It would be asking what advice he would give young filmmakers trying to find their own voice. It would be asking which story he felt most proud to have told. Then he looked back at Joy and delivered the point behind all of it. Those questions, he said, required one thing she seemed unwilling to give, actually caring about the answers. The studio became so quiet that the smallest sounds suddenly seemed noticeable. Joy opened her mouth as if she had another comeback ready, but for perhaps the first time during the entire confrontation, she appeared genuinely unsure of what to say. Eastwood then softened his voice and delivered what may have been his most cutting observation yet. The saddest part, he explained, was that Joy had been given a rare opportunity to have a genuine conversation with someone who had spent decades living through the history of American cinema. Instead of taking that opportunity, she had chosen to turn the interview into a series of cheap confrontations, behaving more like someone chasing clicks than a professional trying to understand her guest. With that, Eastwood finally removed the microphone completely and placed it carefully on the table. And the way he did it made one thing painfully clear. This interview was almost over. Eastwood looked at the microphone on the table and then back toward Joy, making one final point before leaving. This wasn't merely a waste of his time or hers, he said. It was a waste of the audience's time too, because viewers deserved something far more meaningful than the performance they had just been forced to watch. Joy finally found her voice again, but the anger behind it was impossible to hide. She insisted that Eastwood had no right to lecture her about her audience after she had spent decades building a connection with viewers. Eastwood straightened his jacket and calmly questioned whether she had truly connected with them or whether she had simply spent all those years shouting at them. There was a difference, he explained, between creating a genuine connection and simply generating noise, and the distinction had never seemed clearer than it did in that moment. Behind the cameras, producers were now frantically signaling to one another, trying to determine how to contain a situation that had completely escaped their control. This was live television, and their biggest guest was seconds away from walking out after turning the entire confrontation back on one of their own hosts. Then Joy made a desperate call for security. Eastwood actually laughed, and for the first time since the interview began, the laugh sounded completely genuine. He looked around and questioned what security was supposed to do. Arrest him because he had hurt Joy's feelings? Then his expression became serious again as he took one last look around the studio. He reminded everyone that he had spent more than 6 decades in the entertainment industry, working alongside legendary directors, extraordinary actors, and crews who demanded professionalism at every level. Yet throughout all those years, he said, he had rarely encountered anyone quite like Joy. Joy responded sarcastically, asking whether he intended that as some kind of compliment. Eastwood told her she could interpret it however she wanted, but he warned her to remember what viewers would actually remember from the interview. They wouldn't be talking about the supposedly difficult questions or Joy's claims of journalistic integrity. They would be talking about the moment she lost control of the conversation and embarrassed herself on live television. Then, without another dramatic gesture or raised voice, Clint Eastwood turned and began walking toward the studio exit. Behind him, the panel remained frozen. The audience sat in stunned silence, and Joy was left staring after him, as though she still couldn't understand how the interview had slipped so completely out of her control. As the studio doors closed behind Eastwood, the cameras captured Joy's flushed expression and the uncomfortable silence among the remaining hosts. Everyone in that room understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary, but it was hardly the kind of television anyone would want attached to their legacy. And that's how what began as an ordinary promotional appearance transformed into a completely unexpected confrontation. Clint Eastwood had walked into the studio to talk about filmmaking, but when the conversation turned into a battle of personalities, he showed that after more than 6 decades in Hollywood, he could still command a room without ever needing to raise his voice. His weapon this time wasn't a gun or a movie script. It was simply his words, delivered with the same calm precision that made his screen characters legendary. So now the question is yours. Did Joy Behar finally meet someone she couldn't overpower? Or did Eastwood take the confrontation too far? Let me know what you think in the comments, and subscribe for more unforgettable celebrity stories and dramatic moments.